All right, hi everyone. I hope y'all are having a good evening. Today I will be telling you about my Keystone, where I led discussion groups examining heroes and villains through 21st century children's literature using the book The Hostile Hospital. Here are some works that make up what we consider the literary canon. You're probably seeing a lot of books that you've read, or at least books that you would consider classics. You'll also probably notice that these books tend to be pretty old, often centuries old. I spent the first semester of my senior year in a teaching practicum where I had the amazing experience of taking over 2 sixth grade classes from September to December. And I was also able to shadow a book club elective where students chose a book to discuss with the group 2 to 3 times a week. When I was looking over the list of books that they were able to choose from, I was surprised to find that I had actually read most of them when I was in middle school, which was a good 10 years before my students. And the books weren't exactly new at the time. I began to wonder if this was perhaps indicative of a more widespread trend among assigned reading in school. When I was in high school, I remember not even having to buy some of my assigned books because my parents had read them for school when they were my age. And I think everyone wants to feel like their field of study is being constantly adaptive and innovative. And when we start to see evidence that seems to be contrary to that, like I did in my practicum, we want to investigate. There were many aspects I could have chosen to focus on because the literary canon as we generally know it is primarily made up of male-authored, Western-centric works with little cultural diversity or minority representation. But I eventually settled on the contemporary aspect, or in other words, when books had been published. I decided to do that by running a few discussion groups of my own, like I had observed in my practicum. A common aspect of discussion groups, as I'm sure most of you know, is to draw upon outside sources to help you respond to questions or to bring up supporting evidence for your arguments. I was, one, really interested to find out what people had read when they were in middle school or high school, and also what kind of sources people used to respond in discussion questions. So I decided to center my discussion around a pretty common topic, heroes and villains, that I felt would allow participants to draw upon a wide variety of sources when they were responding. When deciding what mentor text I would use to center my discussions around, I knew I wanted it to be a book published in my lifetime, and I wanted it to be both familiar to students currently in the classroom and my participants. I also knew that due to time constraints for college students, who were my primary source of participants, I wanted there to be a faithful and accessible media adaptation because it wouldn't always be feasible to expect people to read a whole book. I was very thankful I considered this due to a lot of my scheduling first being impacted by some IRB delays and secondly by the current pandemic. I ended up settling on The Hostile Hospital from a series of unfortunate events. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a series of 13 books. It's a children's and young adult series, and they were published between 1999 and 2006. The specific book I picked was published in September of 2001, so squarely in the 21st century. And in general, it's been a series that's relatively present in contemporary culture. There have been various games, some companion books, and both a 2005 film and then a more recent Netflix adaptation that has been extremely faithful to each of the book's plots. I remember this series in general being rather popular when I was growing up, and it still is, as quite a few of my sixth grade students were devouring it this year. The series also has a significant focus on heroes and villains, and it seemed pretty ideal for my research. I ended up running 2 discussion groups, both based on the corresponding Netflix episodes for the book. My participants were between 18 and 22 years of age. They came from a variety of educational backgrounds. This in particular was very important to me because I wanted to have representatives from different aspects of the American schooling system. My participants attended public, parochial, private, and STEM or magnet secondary schools. Then from these participants, I collected 2 types of data in my discussions, individual data and then group data. So here you can see examples of questions that were posed during the discussion. Each discussion group began with participants sharing their own school experiences and the books that they read in and out of school at the time. This allowed me to collect the individual data. Then the group questions were mainly suggestions to focus or steer the conversation, but you can see that they allowed for participants to reference or cite sources and were a mix of both general questions centered on themes, such as how would you define a hero or a villain, and then more specific questions directly related to the mentor text, which is that second question on the right. It references the text and then asks for other examples. Once the discussion groups were recorded, I went through and noted every single time a book, movie, TV show, or other form of media was referenced. Then I looked up their dates of publication. I graphed that data in a box and whisker plot, and then I separated by text assigned in school, all the way at the bottom, text read for fun in the middle, and then text referenced in the discussion, which is at the top. I've also marked in red, that line down the right side is the publication date of the text that we actually discussed, which is 2001. So what this plot allows us to see is when the majority of books in each category were published. The boxes represent the middle 50% of texts in that category. And you can see that over here, there's quite a bit of Shakespeare that was assigned in school. So this graph is a little scrunched up because it shows data from 1600 to present day, and you can see some of the pretty stark outliers that are represented by the dots. So I'm going to zoom in to show you the majority of the books. All right, so here you can see that there's actually no overlap in the middle 50% of texts that were assigned in school. That's this purple box, and then texts that were read for fun, which is the blue box. The middle 50% of texts assigned in school to my participants were published between about 1930 and 1970, while the texts read for fun were published between about 1975 and 2010. So there's a slight overlap between these texts that were read for fun and texts referenced in the discussions that I led. You can see that what I referenced up here in pink, this is so tightly concentrated in the 21st century. They're almost entirely between 2008 and 2019. So participants were almost entirely referencing works that had been published after the original discussion text had been published, again, noted there in that red line. So my participants were incredible and gave really thoughtful responses. I didn't do the Keystone for the data, although I'm sure the graphs were fascinating. And so I really wanted to focus on some of the responses that I got. So before the group even started with the real discussion questions, here were some of what they said about assigned reading. Some of it was quite funny, like most of the books we read in middle school were about dogs dying. And then others echoed some common themes. There are books that I'm assigned, and then there are books I want to read, or there was no overlap between what I read in school and what I read for fun. During the actual group discussion, a lot of what was referenced actually was published or came out in the past year or two. So you can see 2019 was a big year in things that were referenced in the discussion. This was the first question that I asked them. How would you define a hero or a villain? So this was the question that they answered immediately after they had just given me all the texts that they read for fun, read in school, and I was pretty surprised to find that none of those were referenced when we actually got to the discussion. These participants really felt like the most salient pieces of evidence when they were answering questions were from the mid to late 2010s, and a lot of it was concentrated in the past year. And I felt that every single time I heard one of these sources, I was just hearing a missed opportunity because I knew that the more recent books and texts in general are some of the least common that you're going to find on an assigned reading list. So I want to leave you with some of the unprompted quotes that I heard in my discussion groups. I don't think my Keystone should suggest or is suggesting that reading older and historical books isn't a valuable part of our education, because it absolutely has a place. But I do think that if students continue to be assigned works that are on average published significantly earlier than what they're choosing to read and then reference in these discussions, as educators, we're not doing all we can to create responsive curricula. These participants in my groups felt like what they had been asked to discuss was, quote, so different from everything, unique. They had never read anything like it. And while that's a great thing to hear on one level because it meant I put together really thoughtful discussion questions, what it also means is that they aren't having these discussions in their own classrooms. And to be frank, we're doing our students a real disservice if we aren't actively promoting contemporary literature in discussions like these whenever we can. Thank you.